It glitters like snow under a burning sun. It lies hidden in deserts, buried beneath mountains, or waiting in the sea. It is so small you can hold in the palm of your hand. And yet, for thousands of years, kingdoms rose and fell over it. This is not gold, not silver, not spices. This is salt. Yes, salt. The crystal that built empires. The mineral that fueled wars, paid armies, crowned kings, and sparked revolutions. Salt was once worth its weight in gold, and it shaped the map of the ancient world. Tonight, we follow the white trail across history, from the desert of Africa to the shores of China, from Roman legions to medieval caravans, to uncover how salt became one of the most powerful forces in human history. This is the Empire Salt. Long before humans knew how to forge iron, plant wheat, or build cities, they sought salt. It is not a luxury. It is not a spice. It is survival. Every drop of sweat, every tear, every heartbeat in your body relies on it. Without salt, muscles fail, minds falter, life itself collapses. Ancient humans learned this the hard way. They followed herds of animals to salt licks. They licked stones themselves. They fought over briny springs. When humanity settled, salt became one of its first treasures. The first cities rose near it. The first trade routes followed it. And soon, salt was more than survival, it was wealth. Imagine a world where salt was so rare, so precious, that entire economies revolved around it. From the Himalayas to the Sahara, from the Roman Forum to the Forbidden City, salt became a currency, a weapon, and sometimes a reason for war. But how exactly did this simple white crystal create empires? Our story begins in the desert of Africa, where salt was the true gold of kings. The Sahara, to most, it is a graveyard of sand, a sea of death, a place no man should cross. But to those who ruled the kingdoms of West Africa, it was a highway, a golden road, paved not with stone but with salt. Over 1,000 years ago, caravans of camels, sometimes 10,000 strong, moved like silent ships across the dunes. Each camel carried slabs of salt, cut from ancient desert lakes, stacked like treasure chests on their backs. These caravans took weeks, sometimes months, to cross the desert. The men who guided them knew the stars like maps, the wind like an old friend. At night, they huddled around fires, telling stories of spirits that haunted the sands. Their destination? The kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, the beating heart of West Africa's wealth. The kingdom of Ghana, where salt was gold. In the 8th century, Ghana was not the country we know today, but a powerful empire. Its kings grew rich by controlling the salt trade. Salt came from the north, gold from the south. Ghana sat between them like a gatekeeper, and every caravan that passed paid tribute. Picture the royal court of Kumbhi, gold dust glinting in the air, kings draped in silk, their guards holding spears tipped with iron. Salt bricks were stacked like building blocks, worth their weight in gold, literally, because where there was no salt, there was death, and where there was too much, there was power. Centuries later, Ghana fell and Mali rose. Its most famous ruler, Mansa Musa, became the richest man who ever lived, his fortune measured in salt, gold, and knowledge. When Musa made his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he brought with him so much gold and salt that the price of gold in Cairo collapsed for a decade. Imagine one man breaking economy, not with war, but with generosity. But Musa's real gift was not gold. It was the city he built, Timbuktu. To the caravans, Timbuktu was a finish line. To scholars, it was paradise. Here, salt paid for books. Books built universities, and knowledge became Mali's true treasure. By the 14th century, Timbuktu's libraries held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Astronomers mapped the stars. Jurists debated law. Poets wrote of love and war. And all of it, every word, was bought with salt. The desert gave salt. The kings gave protection, and together, they built an empire whose memory still glitters in the sands of history. But salt's empire was not just African. To find its next chapter, we must leave the Sahara, cross the Mediterranean, and follow salt to the heart of the ancient world, Rome. Across the Mediterranean, another empire was rising, an empire that claimed the roads, the seas, and even time itself, Rome. But Rome was not built in a day, and it was not built on gold alone. Its soldiers, the backbone of the empire, were paid in something far more precious, salt. The word salary itself comes from salarium, a payment in salt, because in a world without refrigeration, salt was life. To lose salt was to lose your army, and so Rome made sure its legions were always supplied. The Romans built roads, straight as arrows, paved with stone, to move salt from the coast to the heart of the empire. One of the oldest was the Via Salaria, the Salt Road. Through it, Rome fed its citizens, preserved its meat, and kept its empire marching. Picture it. Caravans of ox-drawn carts rolling through the Italian countryside, escorted by legionaries. Every grain of salt a promise that Rome's soldiers would eat, fight, and win. Rome did not just use salt to preserve food. It used it to preserve control. After a rebellion, Roman generals would sometimes sow salt into the fields of their enemies, a ritual curse, ensuring the land to grow nothing, and the memory of defiance would be erased. Whether or not they truly salted Carthage after the Punic Wars is debated by historians. But the message was clear: cross Rome, and your future turns to dust. For the ordinary Roman, salt was more than survival. It was flavor, ritual, even religion. Salt was sprinkled on sacrificial animals, offered to the gods, placed on the tongues of newborns as a blessing. In Roman banquets, a man's place at the table was called his salt cellar. To sit below the salt meant you were of lower status, a phrase that survives to this day. In every sense, spiritual, social, economic, salt was Rome's invisible empire. It moved quietly, but it bound the Mediterranean world together. When Rome fell, salt survived. And when the empire fell, its roads broke, its cities burned. But the salt routes remained. Merchants still walked them. Farmers still dug salt from the earth. And Europe's next great powers would rise along these same lines of trade. The Middle Ages were about to begin, and with them, new battles over who controlled the white gold of the earth. When Rome's roads fell silent, a new power crept onto the stage. Not an empire of legions, but of merchants. The city? Venice. Built on 100 islands, rising out of the misty Adriatic, Venice was no ordinary city. It was a floating fortress, a marketplace without equal, and it guarded its treasure jealously. Venice controlled salt the way kings controlled armies. Its fleets brought it from the salt pans of Chioggia in Serbia, from the Dalmatian coast, even from as far away as Crete. Salt was Venice's lifeblood and its weapon. When a rival city refused to pay Venetian prices, its supply was cut off. Without salt, bread spoiled, fish rotted, and famine crept in. Venice didn't need to invade. It simply waited. This salt diplomacy made Venice rich and dangerous. Its ships became the arteries of Europe's economy. Wherever salt moved, Venetian gold followed. But not all salt was free. In medieval France, salt became a royal monopoly. Every household was required by law to buy a fixed amount of salt, even if they didn't need it. This tax was called a gabelle, and it was despised. Smugglers, known as faux-honneurs, risked their lives to sell untaxed salt. Some were hanged, some were broken on the wheel, but still they came, because the people would not eat their bread without salt. By the 18th century, resentment boiled over. The gabelle became a symbol of royal oppression, one of the sparks that would set off the French Revolution. When the Bastille fell, it was not just the king's tyranny that died, but the salt tax that had starved the poor. Salt even became a cause for war. In the 14th century, Venice and Genoa fought bitterly over access to salt supplies. Wars fought not just with fleets, but with assassins, spies, and sabotage. Salt storehouses were burned. Merchant convoys were ambushed on moonless nights. The price of salt could rise overnight, and with it, the price of survival. Salt was not just an economic weapon. It was spiritual. Medieval monks blessed salt before sprinkling it into holy water. It symbolized purity, preservation of the soul. Even today, the phrase, "worth of salt," comes from these centuries, a measure of man's value. By the end of the Middle Ages, salt had shaped kingdoms, banqueted cities, and built empires without ever drawing a sword. It was the invisible empire, and yet new empires were stirring beyond Europe. Empires of desert sands and golden trade routes, where salt was not just valuable, it was worth its weight in gold. Across the Sahara, the sun is merciless. The horizon shimmers like glass. The earth cracks underfoot. And yet here, in this barren ocean of sand, move one of the greatest trade networks the world has ever known, the caravans of salt. Salt in the Sahara was not just food, it was currency. In the markets of Timbuktu, slabs of salt the size of doorways were stacked like treasure. Some were carved from the mines of Toppled, 500 miles into the desert. There, slaves chipped salt from the earth in brutal heat, loading it onto camels for a journey that could last months. Each caravan might have 1,000 camels, each bearing 200 pounds of salt. It was a moving city, merchants, guards, cooks, storytellers, and children, all bound together by survival and profit. In the 13th and 14th centuries, this salt trade fueled the rise of the Mali Empire. Its kings were unimaginably wealthy, and none more so than Mansa Musa. When Musa made his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he brought so much gold with him that he caused inflation in Cairo that lasted for years. But that gold had been traded for salt. Salt that preserved food, fed armies, and made life possible in a hot, unforgiving land. Mali's power rested not on conquest alone, but on controlling this flow of white gold. Every caravan paid taxes. Every merchant gave tribute. The empire grew rich, and with wealth came culture. Libraries, mosques, scholars who made Timbuktu the city of books. But salt's power had a darker side. Along with salt came slaves, captured in war, traded like cattle, marched across the desert under the burning sky. Some carried the very salt that bought their freedom or sealed their fate. The caravans were lifelines, but they were also instruments of suffering. The desert was never safe. Bandits stalked the trade routes, waiting to strike. A single raid could destroy a caravan, leaving survivors to die of thirst. So kings built armies, fortified oases, and guarded the trade with their lives. To lose control of the salt trade was to lose an empire. At night, around the fires, merchants told stories of ghost cities buried in the dunes, of cursed wells, of entire caravans swallowed by sandstorms. Some swore they heard the cries of the lost, carried on the wind. But still, the trade continued. For as long as humans needed salt, they would brave the desert. When Europeans arrived centuries later, they were astonished by what they saw. Libraries filled with manuscripts, cities alive with scholars and poets, all of it built on salt. Even today, slabs of salt are still mined from Toppled and carried by camel to distant markets, a living echo of the medieval empires that once ruled the Sahara. Salt was the invisible thread that stitched Africa together. And now, that same thread would stretch even farther, across continents and oceans, to shape the fate of the world. The desert gave salt its power, but the sea would make it eternal. By the 15th century, the great empires of Europe were hungry for wealth, spices, gold, and salt. For without salt, their armies starved, their fleets rotted, their cities stank with spoiled meat, and so they looked beyond the horizon to oceans uncharted. In Lisbon, a young prince named Henry dreamed of reaching the riches of Africa and Asia, not by land, but by sea. Portuguese sailors hugged the African coast, inch by inch, mapping rivers, trading for gold, and yes, salt. Every voyage was a gamble. Storms could swallow ships whole. Scurvy could empty a deck of men. But slowly, they pressed farther south, until they reached the place where the Atlantic meets the Indian Ocean, the Cape of Good Hope. From there, the world opened like a book. When Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa in 1498 and reached India, he brought back pepper, cinnamon, cloves, treasures worth their weight in gold. But none of this trade would have worked without salt. Salted fish fed the sailors who crossed the seas. Salted meat kept them alive through storms and doldrums. Salted hides and salted goods filled their cargo holds. Salt was not the star of the story, but it was a quiet, indispensable companion that made exploration possible. Across the ocean, the Spanish dreamed even bigger. In 1492, Columbus sailed west, seeking a shortcut to Asia. What he found was something far greater, a new world. Salt became one of the first tools of conquest. The Spanish learned from the Taino and Aztec how to extract salt from coastal flats. Salted food allowed soldiers and settlers to push inland, establish forts, and control entire regions. Soon, every European power, Spain, Portugal, England, France, the Dutch, built empires across oceans. Sugar from the Caribbean, silver from the Andes, spices from the Indies, and salt? Salt became the invisible infrastructure that kept it all running. Salted cod fed enslaved Africans in the Americas. Salted meat fed soldiers in colonial wars. Salt taxed and traded became a weapon of control. Those who held the salt works could choke a region's economy overnight. But salt was also a spark for revolution. In France, the hated gabelle, a salt tax, became one of the grievances that led to the French Revolution. In India centuries later, the British salt monopoly would provoke Gandhi's Salt March, a single act of civil disobedience that would shake the foundations of empire. By the 17th century, the world was tied together by sea lanes, a web of trade routes carrying spices, sugar, tea, silver, and salt. The age of exploration was not just about glory and discovery. It was about control. Control of the resources that kept cities alive and armies marching. And salt was there at every step, quiet, constant, essential. Salt had traveled from desert mines to imperial palaces, from African caravans to Caribbean plantations. It was no longer just a mineral. It was power, the kind of power that could build empires or bring them crashing down. For centuries, salt had been the quiet backbone of empires. But what happens when the rulers hold salt too tightly? When they tax it, hoard, control who may taste it? Salt becomes a weapon, and weapons can start revolutions. In 14th century France, the monarchy introduced a tax on salt, the gabelle. At first, it seemed small, but as the centuries passed, the tax grew heavier. Peasants were forbidden to gather their own salt from marshes. Every family was required to buy a minimum amount of heavily taxed salt each year, whether they needed it or not. It wasn't just unfair, it was humiliating. Salt smuggling became a way of life. Faux sauniers, illegal salt sellers, operated under cover of night. Caught smugglers faced prison, branding, even the gallows. By the 18th century, resentment boiled over. When the French Revolution came, the gabelle was among the first injustices swept away. For the revolutionaries, the fall of the salt tax was more than economics. It was freedom. Salt, once the king's weapon, had become the people's banner. Half a world away, in 1930, another empire faced a reckoning. In British India, salt was a state monopoly. Ordinary Indians could not legally collect their own salt, even from the sea that washed their shores. Then came a small, quiet man, Mohandas Gandhi. He did not call for riots, nor for war. Instead, he walked 240 miles, from Sabarmati to the Arabian Sea. Each day, more followed him, peasants, students, workers, women. When he reached the shore, Gandhi bent down, picked up a lump of salt, and held it high. A simple gesture, a direct act of defiance, and a signal that the empire's grip was breaking. Within months, tens of thousands were arrested, but the world was watching. Photographs of Gandhi, serene even in handcuffs, circled the globe. The Salt March had turned a grain of salt into a rallying cry for independence. Even in the American colonies, salt played its part. During the Revolutionary War, the British Navy blockaded ports, cutting off salt imports. Without salt, meat spoiled, fish rotted, armies starved. The Continental Congress urged every colony to build salt works along the coast. Patriots boiled seawater day and night, producing enough to keep Washington's army fed through the winter. Salt had become more than a necessity. It was a symbol of self-reliance, of resistance, of the determination to survive. In every revolution, salt was there, in the shadows, on the tables of the poor, in the tears of protesters. It was not glorious like gold or intoxicating like spices, but it was essential, and that is why it mattered so much. Salt was the quiet companion of rebellion, the mineral that said in its small, crystalline voice, "You cannot control life itself." When we trace the great revolutions of history, we often speak of muskets, manifestos, and fiery speeches. But sometimes, history turns on something far smaller. Something as small as a grain of salt. The ancient world fought wars over salt, but in the industrial age, salt became something far greater. It became the raw material of progress itself. In the 18th and 19th centuries, science began to see salt not just a seasoning, but as a mystery to be unlocked. When chemists isolated the elements within it, sodium and chlorine, they discovered the building blocks of modern chemistry. Sodium became a key player in creating soap, glass, paper. Chlorine became essential in bleaching cloth, turning once drab textiles into brilliant whites that sparked new fashion revolutions. Even medicine changed. Salt solutions saved lives on battlefields, keeping soldiers alive through blood loss and dehydration. The simple mineral had entered the laboratory and reshaped the modern world. Asterisk. Salt also powered factories, literally. Brine was used to produce soda ash, a vital chemical for glass-making and soap. Entire towns sprang up around salt works. Places like Cheshire in England or Wieliczka in Poland, where vast salt mines became underground cities of labor, their tunnels carved like cathedrals. For the first time, salt was being produced on an industrial scale, feeding not just kitchens, but economies. But progress is a dark side. Saltpetre, potassium nitrate, was essential for making gunpowder. Armies scoured the earth for it, sometimes even scraping it from cave walls and barn floors. Without saltpetre, no musket would fire, no cannon would roar. Salt, once a quiet preserver of food, had become a preserver of war. Before refrigeration, salt was humanity's best defense against hunger. It kept fish edible on months-long sea voyages. It allowed meat to be stored through winter. Entire whaling expeditions, cod fisheries, and trade networks depended on salt barrels packed to the brim. And then, with the invention of artificial refrigeration in the 19th century, salt played a new role as a cooling agent. Ice-making machines relied on brine to absorb heat, allowing cities to store fresh milk, meat, and vegetables for the first time in history. Salt had moved from the battlefield to the dinner table to the very heart of the modern home. And let us not forget its color, quite literally. When chemists burned sodium, they discovered it glowed a brilliant, unmistakable yellow. Today, every street lamp with that golden hue owes its light to sodium vapor. The same chemical that once preserved the meat of soldiers now illuminates the roads they once marched. By the dawn of the 20th century, salt was no longer a luxury. It was cheap, abundant everywhere. And yet, its quiet power only grew. It became a chemical catalyst for plastics, for explosives, for medicine. It flowed through factories, railroads, and laboratories. It was invisible, but was everywhere, shaping a world racing toward modernity. Salt had come a long way. No longer just a seasoning. No longer just a symbol of power. It was now the hidden engine of an industrial world, quietly fueling revolutions of science, food, and technology. But the story was not over, for in the 20th century, salt would face its final transformation from a treasure to a threat, and the world would discover that too much of a good thing can tip the balance of health and history. Salt has always been with us, but in the modern world, it became something far more personal, a matter of health, habit, and hidden power. In the early 20th century, doctors made a discovery that would save millions. In certain regions, far from the sea, children were developing goiters, swollen thyroid glands that stunted growth and dulled the mind. The culprit? A lack of iodine, a trace element found naturally in seafood and coastal soils. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Put iodine in table salt. By the 1920s, governments began iodizing salt, turning a simple seasoning into public health policy. Goiters virtually disappeared. Generations of children grew taller, healthier, sharper, all thanks to the pinch of salt on their dinner tables. But with abundance came excess. Salt was everywhere, in bread, in butter, in canned goods, in pickles, in meats. By the mid-20th century, scientists began to worry. High blood pressure, strokes, heart attacks. Could too much salt be the culprit? The debate rages even now. Some studies show a link. Others argue our bodies are far more adaptable, that salt is not the villain, but part of a bigger story of sugar, fat, and the modern diet. Still, public health campaigns urged us, cut back, hide the salt shaker. Salt, once the most sought-after treasure in history, had become something to fear. Salt may have lost its royal status, but it never lost its economic power. Today, salt is a global industry worth billions. It keeps roads safe in winter. Millions of tons are spread on icy highways every year. It drives chemical plants that make everything from PVC pipes to fertilizers. Even the batteries in our phones owe something to salt chemistry. In a strange twist, the world now consumes more salt for industry than for food. Salt is still wrapped in myth. Throw salt over your shoulder to ward off bad luck. Spill salt and misfortune will follow. In some cultures, salt is still used to bless doorways, purify homes, or protect against evil spirits. We no longer fight wars over salt, but it still carries a quiet, mystical weight, as though we sense that this simple crystal has always been more than just food. Even now, scientists are finding new ways to use it. Salt-based batteries may help store renewable energy. Salt caverns are used to hold natural gas and even hydrogen for the coming green economy. And in medicine, saline drips remain a cornerstone of saving lives in every hospital on Earth. For something so simple, so ancient, salt refuses to become ordinary. It is still shaping the future, as it has shaped the past. So, the next time you lift a salt shaker, remember, you are holding the history of empires, the power of survival, the spark of industry, and the secret of life itself, all in a single grain. Salt is not just seasoning, it is civilization. We began this journey thousands of years ago, following the trail of salt through deserts, rivers, and seas. We walked with pharaohs and Roman generals, with caravans across the Sahara, and with sailors braving the monsoon winds. We watched cities rise on salt wealth, and empires fall when that wealth was taken away. And through it all, one thing never changed: humanity's hunger for survival and for meaning. Salt was never just about taste. It was about power. It was about connection between people, between lands, between ages. It shaped trade routes, shaped wars, shaped us. And it still does. Every pinch, every grain, a reminder where we came from and how far we have yet to go. If this journey through time moved you, join us as we uncover more forgotten stories of the world's great empires and the quiet forces that shaped them. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and share this story, so more seekers can find their way back through history's hidden roads. Because the past is never truly past. It waits for us just beneath the surface.